I think my friend Richard Gale's main point here is not that these things he proposes are in fact false, these implications of theism, but that they comprise a certain cost. So if you're a theist, if you're a Christian theist, you're sticking your neck out in a certain way. You know, you're saying something which in some sense could be false, so you're taking a certain risk, and that's quite true. Also true for naturalism, or in fact for any philosophical proposition, or in fact for any proposition of any kind except possibly, say, mathematical propositions where ones which are sort of totally and utterly obvious. Otherwise, if you say anything significant, you are sticking your neck out. The particular costs he proposes, though, here, don't seem to me to amount to much. For example, here's one cost. Here is one cost. The underlying tenet of this scientific metaphysics is that science tells us of what there is, that it is, and of what is not, that it is not. Since each of these three tenets of theistic metaphysics finds no place in the scientific take on the world, they are false. So the cost here, one cost is that the theist has to reject the idea that any proposition which doesn't find a place in the scientific take on the world is false. The theist has to reject that. That's quite right. But that view, that proposition is eminently rejectable anyway. In fact, I think that proposition is necessarily false, and the cost of rejecting a necessarily false proposition is pretty minimal. In fact, I'd say it's completely minimal. No cost at all to rejecting something that's necessarily false. Why do I think it's necessarily false? Well, it says if something doesn't find a place in the scientific take on the world, then it's false. Theism doesn't find a place in the scientific take on the world, so theism is false. Science doesn't say theism is true, so it's false. But similarly, atheism isn't part of science. Science doesn't say atheism is true, so atheism would have to be false too on this principle. Both theism and atheism would have to be false, and that's a contradiction. That would be to say that theism is true because atheism is false, but also false. Theism would have to be both true and false, and atheism would have to be both true and false if that principle were true. And that's a bit too much to put up with. A principle like that, I would say, is necessarily false, and so the cost of rejecting it is minimal. Next, there is bifurcationism, which is the thought that all the rest, that is, only the so-called primary qualities, those that are needed for the formulation of scientific laws and theories, only they have objective reality. All the rest, such as sensory, emotional, evaluative, and aesthetic qualities, are relegated to the dung heap of the subjective, being nothing but the ways in which organisms like us are consciously appeared to. That's another thing, then, that the theist has to reject. But again, it seems to me that's eminently rejectable. There's very little cost in rejecting the idea that only primary qualities have any reality, so that, for example, there isn't anything real about morality. I say there is something real about morality, and I think we all think so. I mean, I think that's the natural human thing to think. For example, I believe it's not right for me to lie about my colleagues in order to advance my career. And I suspect most of you would agree with me. That's not the right sort of thing to do. I don't think for a moment that science shows that it's not true that that's not right. Science doesn't speak on that topic at all, and quite properly so. So I don't see that there is any cost here coming from science in saying that there is more to the world than these primary qualities. Next, physicalism. Here the thought is, he says, the spirit, if not the letter, of modern science looks askance at the ontological dualism between mind and matter. So physicalism, so science, he says, rejects what I was arguing for this afternoon, namely psychophysical, rejects dualism. That is, the idea that human beings are not themselves material objects, but rather are souls, let's say, or minds or selves that have material bodies. Well, 2 points here. First, it isn't part of Christianity. It's not an implication of Christianity to say that human beings are immaterial objects. As I said this afternoon, there are Christian philosophers, my colleague Peter Van Inwagen being an example, whom I mentioned this afternoon, who are themselves materialists about human beings, think that human beings are in fact material objects. So it's not really a cost of Christianity. But second, if it were, it would be one that I, again, would be very happy to pay, because it seems to me the idea that human beings are just material objects, that's false, and I think demonstrably false. Because as I was arguing this afternoon, I think one can see that it's not the case that a merely material object could be about something or could think about something. So again, the cost here is minimal. In general, I would say the cost associated with naturalism is much higher than the cost associated with Christian theism. And so while I agree with Richard that there are some costs connected with being a theist, with being a Christian theist, you do stick your neck out in doing so, I would say the particular costs he proposes do not amount to much.